Marguerite de Valois. Acceptes-tu pour époux Henri de Bourbon, roi de Navarre? Au nom du Père, au nom du Fils.
August 18th, 1572. The most expensive wedding in French history has just concluded, and Paris is celebrating what everyone believes will be the marriage that finally brings peace to a war-torn nation. 6 days later, the streets are flowing with blood, and the wedding guests are being hunted like animals. What started as Europe's most hopeful political alliance became the trigger for one of history's most savage betrayals. The groom was Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince, who would eventually become King Henry IV of France. The bride was Margaret of Valois, sister to the Catholic King Charles IX. Their marriage was supposed to symbolize religious reconciliation. Instead, it became the bait for the most carefully orchestrated royal massacre in European history. When the killing finally stopped 2 months later, up to 25,000 people were dead across France. Rivers literally ran red with blood. Wedding guests who had come to celebrate peace became corpses floating down the Seine. And the royal family who had hosted this celebration of unity, they were the ones who gave the orders to kill. But here's where it gets truly twisted. This wasn't a spontaneous explosion of religious hatred. This was a premeditated royal betrayal that used a wedding celebration as cover for systematic murder. This wasn't just any royal marriage. This was the union that was supposed to end a decade of religious civil war in France. The French Wars of Religion had been devastating the country since 1562. Catholics and Protestants had fought 3 separate wars, with entire cities massacred, noble families destroyed, and the royal treasury drained. By 1572, everyone was exhausted from the bloodshed. The Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in 1570 had ended the Third War, but nobody trusted it to last. That's where Catherine de' Medici came in with her master plan. As Queen Mother and the real power behind her weak son, King Charles IX, Catherine decided that the only way to achieve lasting peace was through marriage diplomacy. She would marry her daughter Margaret to Henry of Navarre, the most important Protestant noble in France. Henry of Navarre wasn't just any Protestant. He was the heir to the throne of Navarre and the acknowledged leader of the Huguenot cause. If he could be brought into the royal family through marriage, it would signal to both sides that religious reconciliation was possible. The wedding would be held in Paris, the Catholic stronghold, with Protestant and Catholic nobles attending together in a grand display of unity. But here's what makes this story so sinister. Catherine's plan was working too well. Thousands of Protestant nobles traveled to Paris for the wedding, bringing their families and retinues. For the first time in years, the most important Huguenot leaders were all gathered in one place. The wedding itself was a spectacle designed to impress Europe. No expense was spared. Elaborate tournaments, public feasts, theatrical performances, and ceremonies that lasted for days. The message was clear. France was wealthy, stable, and ready for peace. But the most dangerous guest at this celebration wasn't wearing wedding finery. It was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the military leader of the Protestant cause and the one man Catherine de' Medici feared above all others. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny was everything Catherine de' Medici despised. Charismatic, principled, and worst of all, he had been gaining dangerous influence over her son, King Charles IX. By 1572, this Protestant war hero had become the Queen Mother's greatest nightmare, and his presence at the wedding was about to trigger the bloodiest betrayal in French history. More dangerously for Catherine, Coligny had been readmitted to the Royal Council in 1571 and was advocating for a foreign policy that threatened everything she had worked to build. The young King Charles IX was fascinated by Coligny's military expertise and increasingly relied on his counsel. Catherine watched in horror as her son, who she had controlled completely, began making decisions based on the advice of a Protestant war leader. The Queen Mother was losing her grip on power, and she knew it. Charles IX had grown up weak and indecisive, constantly dominated by his formidable mother. In Coligny, he found a father figure who treated him like a real king instead of a puppet. The admiral would address him with respect, ask for his opinions on military matters, and make him feel like the powerful monarch he was supposed to be. For Catherine, this relationship was an existential threat. She had spent years positioning herself as the indispensable power behind the throne. If Charles IX started making independent decisions based on Coligny's advice, her entire political structure would collapse. But here's what makes Coligny's position at the wedding so crucial. He came to Paris not as a war leader, but as a peacemaker. He genuinely believed that the marriage alliance could work, and that religious reconciliation was possible. His guard was down because he trusted in the royal family's commitment to peace. The Protestant nobles who accompanied him felt the same way. They saw the wedding as proof that they could finally lay down their arms and participate in French political life as equals rather than as rebels. They came to Paris celebrating what they believed was their victory, the acceptance of Protestant legitimacy by the Catholic crown. They had no idea they were walking into the most carefully orchestrated trap in French history. On August 22, 1572, Admiral Coligny was walking through the streets of Paris, probably feeling safer than he had in years, when a musket ball tore through his arm and lodged in his hand. The assassination attempt failed, but those few seconds of violence were about to trigger the bloodiest religious massacre in French history. The shot came from a window as Coligny was returning from a meeting with the king. The attempted murder sent shockwaves through both Protestant and Catholic communities in Paris. The Huguenot nobles were furious. Their most important leader had been attacked while under royal protection in the capital. This was exactly the kind of treachery they had feared, and it seemed to prove that the peace was a sham. King Charles IX's reaction was swift and seemingly genuine. He visited Coligny personally, expressed outrage at the attack, and promised a thorough investigation. He posted royal guards at the admiral's residence and publicly declared that whoever was responsible would face the harshest punishment. To the Protestant nobles, it appeared that the king was genuinely committed to protecting them. But behind the scenes, the real drama was unfolding. The assassination attempt had been organized by the Guise family, the leaders of the ultra-Catholic faction who blamed Coligny for the death of Francis, Duke of Guise, in 1563. The Guises had been planning this revenge for years, and they had finally found their opportunity. However, the most crucial question was whether Catherine de' Medici had known about the plot in advance. The evidence suggests she had given her approval, seeing it as a way to eliminate the Protestant leader who threatened her influence over the king. But when the assassination failed, Catherine faced a catastrophic problem. The wounded Coligny was now more dangerous than ever. He was alive, angry, and had the complete sympathy of the king. Worse yet, he was calling for a full investigation that might expose Catherine's involvement in the plot. The Protestant nobles were demanding justice, and Charles IX seemed inclined to give it to them. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Catherine realized that a failed assassination attempt had put her in a position where she might lose everything. If Coligny's investigation proceeded, it could destroy her politically. If the Protestant nobles turned against the crown, it could mean civil war. She was trapped between two impossible choices. So she made a third choice, one that would stain French history with blood for centuries to come. On the night of August 23rd, Catherine de' Medici made the decision that would transform a failed assassination into a systematic massacre. Rather than face the consequences of the botched attempt on Coligny's life, she convinced her son, King Charles IX, that the only way to save the monarchy was to eliminate the Protestant leadership entirely. The meeting took place in the Tuileries Palace, with Catherine, the king, and a small group of Catholic nobles deciding the fate of thousands. According to historical accounts, Catherine argued that the Huguenots were planning a coup in response to the attack on Coligny. Whether she actually believed this or simply used it as justification, the argument worked on the impressionable young king. Charles IX was terrified of losing his throne and had been raised to see Protestants as inherent threats to royal authority. Catherine convinced him that the wedding had been a mistake. Instead of achieving peace, it had simply gathered all their enemies in one place where they could plot against the crown. The only solution was to strike first. The plan they developed was diabolically simple. They would assassinate the Protestant leadership during the night, claiming it was necessary to prevent a Huguenot rebellion. The attack would begin with Coligny, but it wouldn't stop there. They had a list of dozens of Protestant nobles who were staying in Paris for the wedding festivities. To carry out the killings, they enlisted the help of the Guise family and their Catholic supporters. Henri de Guise himself would lead the attack on Coligny's residence, while other Catholic nobles would handle the remaining targets. The city militia would be told that the king had ordered the suppression of a Protestant conspiracy. But here's what makes this plan so horrifying. It was designed to look like royal justice rather than cold-blooded murder. Each assassination would be framed as the execution of a traitor, giving the killers legal cover for their actions. The wedding guests who had come to celebrate peace would be hunted down as enemies of the state. The signal for the massacre would be the ringing of the bell at the Church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. When that bell tolled just before dawn on August 24th, it would mark the beginning of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Catherine had one final concern. What about her new son-in-law, Henry of Navarre, and his cousin, the Prince de Condé? Both were Protestant princes who couldn't simply be murdered without major political consequences. The solution was elegant in its cynicism. They would be spared, but forced to convert to Catholicism at sword point. This would eliminate their effectiveness as Protestant leaders, while avoiding the diplomatic crisis that would come from killing royalty. The trap was set. Protestant nobles were sleeping peacefully in their lodgings throughout Paris, probably having pleasant dreams about the new era of religious tolerance. They had no idea that in a few hours, their hosts would become their executioners. At dawn on August 24th, 1572, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois began to toll, and Paris transformed from a city celebrating peace into a slaughterhouse that would shock all of Europe. What happened next was so savage that even contemporary observers struggled to find words to describe the horror. The killing began with Admiral Coligny. Henri de Guise led a group of armed men to the admiral's residence, where they overwhelmed the Protestant guards and forced their way into his bedroom. Contemporary accounts describe Coligny facing his killers with remarkable courage, reportedly saying, "Would that I might at least die at the hands of a soldier, and not of a valet," before being stabbed repeatedly. But the true horror of what followed wasn't the death of one man. It was what the killers did next. They threw Coligny's body out of his bedroom window to the courtyard below, where a Catholic mob had gathered. The crowd cheered as the corpse hit the ground, then began mutilating it with knives and clubs. That was the signal for the massacre to spread throughout the city. Catholic militiamen and armed civilians began going house to house in the districts where Protestant wedding guests were staying. They carried lists of names and addresses, systematically hunting down specific targets while also killing any Huguenots they encountered. The organized assassinations quickly devolved into general mob violence. Catholic Parisians who had nothing to do with the original plot began attacking their Protestant neighbors, settling personal grudges under the cover of religious warfare. Shops were looted, homes burned, and entire families murdered in their beds. Contemporary witness Jacques-Auguste Thau described seeing Protestant bodies thrown into the Seine River in such numbers that the water ran red with blood. The killing was so intense that the river couldn't carry away all of the corpses, and they began piling up against the bridges. Meanwhile, in the Louvre Palace, Protestant nobles who had been guests at the royal wedding were being systematically slaughtered by royal guards. Men who had danced at the celebration just days earlier were now being hunted through the corridors of the palace like animals. Henry of Navarre and the Prince de Condé were dragged before King Charles IX and given a choice: convert to Catholicism immediately or join their fellow Protestants in death. Both chose conversion, probably hoping they could recant later if they survived. But here's what makes this massacre truly unprecedented. It didn't stop after the initial targets were eliminated. The violence took on a life of its own, continuing for days as Catholic mobs roamed the streets looking for victims. By August 29th, when the killing finally subsided in Paris, an estimated 3,000 people were dead. And Paris was just the beginning. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre didn't end in Paris. It metastasized across France like a plague of religious hatred, with copycat killings erupting in dozens of cities as local Catholics took the royal massacre as permission to settle their own scores with Protestant neighbors. When news of the Paris killings reached the provinces, it arrived with conflicting messages. Some reports claimed the king had ordered the extermination of all Huguenots throughout France. Others said the violence was unauthorized and should be stopped. Local Catholic officials had to decide which version to believe, and many chose the interpretation that justified their own desire for revenge. In Rouen, the governor initially tried to protect local Protestants by placing them in protective custody. But Catholic mobs broke into the prisons and slaughtered the Huguenots anyway. Similar scenes played out in Lyon, where hundreds of Protestants were killed, despite official attempts to maintain order. The provincial massacres revealed something even more disturbing than the original Paris killings. This wasn't just about eliminating Protestant political leaders. This was about ordinary Catholics murdering their Protestant neighbors, people they had lived and worked alongside for years. In Orleans, Catholic artisans killed Protestant merchants who had been their business partners. In Bordeaux, families that had intermarried across religious lines found themselves on opposite sides of a murderous divide. The wedding that was supposed to symbolize religious reconciliation had instead given permission for the deepest hatreds to surface. The death toll mounted week by week. Modern historians estimate that between 5,000 and 7,000 additional Protestants were killed in the provinces, bringing the total death count to somewhere between 10,000 and 25,000 people. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The real damage was to the possibility of religious coexistence in France. Protestant communities that had survived the killings were traumatized beyond recovery. Many converted to Catholicism out of fear, while others fled to Protestant strongholds in southern France or emigrated to more tolerant countries. The Huguenot population of France, which had represented about 10% of the country before the massacre, shrank dramatically in its aftermath. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the provincial killings was how they revealed the true nature of the religious hatred that the royal wedding had been designed to heal. This wasn't just political violence. It was neighbor turning against neighbor, friend betraying friend, and families destroying themselves over questions of faith. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had accomplished something that years of religious war had failed to achieve. It had made peaceful coexistence between French Catholics and Protestants virtually impossible for generations to come. When Pope Gregory XIII heard the news from Paris, he was so delighted that he ordered special masses of thanksgiving and had a commemorative medal struck to celebrate the massacre. This reaction from the head of the Catholic Church reveals just how completely the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had destroyed any hope of religious reconciliation in Europe. The immediate political consequences were catastrophic for France. The massacre convinced Protestant nations that Catholic rulers could never be trusted, poisoning diplomatic relations for decades. England's Queen Elizabeth I, who had been considering a marriage alliance with France, immediately broke off negotiations. Protestant princes in Germany and the Netherlands saw the killings as proof that Catholics viewed treaties as worthless scraps of paper. King Charles IX tried to control the narrative by claiming responsibility for the massacre, declaring that it had been necessary to prevent a Huguenot conspiracy against the crown. But this justification fooled no one. European observers recognized it as a premeditated betrayal that violated every principle of royal hospitality and diplomatic immunity. The massacre also destroyed the French monarchy's moral authority within France itself. The idea that kings ruled by divine right and could be trusted to protect their subjects had been shattered. If the royal family could murder wedding guests under their own protection, what other betrayals were possible? For the Protestant survivors, the lesson was clear. Accommodation with Catholic authorities was impossible. The moderate Protestant leaders who had believed in peaceful coexistence were dead, replaced by radicals who advocated armed resistance. The Fourth War of Religion began before the year was over, and it would be more brutal than any of the previous conflicts. Catherine de' Medici's plan to eliminate the Protestant threat had backfired spectacularly. Instead of destroying the Huguenot cause, the massacre had created martyrs and united Protestant opposition. Instead of securing her power, it had made her son's reign synonymous with treachery and murder. But the most lasting damage was cultural. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre entered European consciousness as a symbol of religious fanaticism and political betrayal. It would be cited for centuries as an example of what happens when faith becomes a weapon and when rulers abandon moral constraints. The irony is that Henry of Navarre, the Protestant groom who had been forced to convert to save his life, eventually became King Henry IV of France. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, which finally granted religious tolerance to French Protestants. The religious reconciliation that the 1572 wedding was supposed to achieve had to wait 26 years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. So here's the question that historians still debate. Was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre the inevitable result of religious hatred that had been building for decades? Or was it a preventable tragedy caused by the personal ambitions of Catherine de' Medici? The evidence suggests it was both. The religious tensions were real and dangerous. France had been fighting civil wars for a decade, and the hatred between Catholics and Protestants ran deep enough to motivate ordinary citizens to murder their neighbors. But the specific trigger for the massacre was Catherine's decision to solve a political problem through mass murder. The royal wedding that was supposed to heal France's religious divisions instead became the perfect setup for the greatest betrayal in French history. The Protestant nobles who came to Paris celebrating peace became victims of systematic slaughter. The marriage that symbolized hope for tolerance became a blood wedding that poisoned relations between Christians for generations. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre reminds us that tolerance is fragile, that peace is always provisional, and that the powerful will sacrifice anyone, even their own wedding guests, to maintain their positions. When those in authority decide that some people don't deserve to live, the distance between a royal palace and a slaughterhouse becomes very small indeed. The bells that rang for Margaret and Henry's wedding became the signal for mass murder. The guests who came to celebrate religious reconciliation became corpses floating in the Seine, and the royal family who hosted this celebration of unity, they proved that when power feels threatened, even the most sacred obligations, hospitality, kinship, and the protection of guests, become expendable. What do you think? Was this massacre an inevitable explosion of religious hatred? Or could different choices by the royal family have prevented it?